The complexity of a currency for Scotland. My name is Ian Angel, and for half a century I have been studying complexity in the nature of causality and consequence. Putting it simply, I am fascinated by how things never turn out the way they were planned. One of the harsh lessons I have learned during this time is that the well intentioned actions of those who naively promise utopia always set in train a dystopian explosion of complex consequences which cannot be controlled or even contained. Granted, some causal pathways may be forecast within the complexity of outcomes. Indeed, it may be possible, just partially, to predict some chaotic emergent consequences. Well, that's what I'm doing. However, the final endgame will only ever be totally described in hindsight by historians, long after the dust has settled. Now, let me give you some of my partial predictions in a case that currently I am finding most intriguing. I am referring to Scottish nationalism, a cause that raises extreme passions on both sides, but towards which personally I am totally neutral. Nevertheless, as an outside, impartial observer, I find it completely fascinating, particularly the way nationalists propose to manage their currency after achieving independence. Apparently, they want eventually to settle down in the utopia of the Eurozone. However, in the interim, they will continue with sterling. Simple, not complicated at all. Just keep on using sterling until it's time to swap to the euro. This is a complete misunderstanding of the latent complexity hiding within the nature of money. Following independence, unless Westminster continues to treat Scotland as if it was still part of the United Kingdom, and believe me, it won't, this strategy will pile layer upon layer of new complexity onto the Scottish people, even ignoring the macroeconomic consequences of independence. The simple practicalities of microeconomic feedback could be a real headache. Scotland already produces its own banknotes issued by the Royal Bank of Scotland, the Bank of Scotland, and the Clydesdale Bank. They even have a £100 note, not available in England. Now, despite Scottish notes being a legal currency, they do not have the status of legal tender. That is, there is no law that will force anyone in England to accept Scottish notes. Indeed, many businesses south of the border refuse to take them. Thankfully, for the Scots, English banks will accept Scottish notes as sterling and exchange them one for one. At present, that is, while there is still a United Kingdom. But this practice is going to stop on Scotland gaining independence. In effect, these notes, despite being denominated in terms of sterling, would in fact be a foreign currency in England and would therefore have to be bought and sold at variable exchange rates plus commission. Gresham's law would start to operate. Bad money drives out good. When Scots come to England, they would have to buy English pounds, and vice versa whenever the English go north. However, the authorities would have to recall all Scottish banknotes very quickly and change their wording. For you could buy a Scottish £100 note at a discount in England and then take it to a Scottish bank and ask for £100 sterling. For that's what the present note says. £100 sterling, not 100 Scottish pounds. The complexity of a new arbitrage trade would certainly emerge. Of course, this could be avoided if the printing of Scottish banknotes was stopped and only Bank of England notes were used. Would this matter? Since, after all, most of the money in circulation is not cash anyway, but numbers in bank accounts and as credit. Yes, of course it matters, because the Westminster government would then be in total control of the money supply in Scotland, and the economic needs of Scotland would not factor into any decisions over the currency. What is money? Money is a consequence of the way it operates. Money is a promise to repay a debt, but with money. Money works only when people believe it works. In this self-referential system, all citizens are stakeholders to the greater or lesser extent. Independent Scots, however, now as parasitic users of sterling, would have no direct stake in sterling. Those in the Bank of England in charge of maintaining sterling will therefore totally ignore the wishes and demands of the Scots. But then that is no different to Brussels being in total control once the Scots adopt the euro. Just ask the Greeks for what happens. So much for independence. The vast majority of money does not exist as notes or coins from the government float, rather as an imaginary numbers that a government-backed fractional reserve system allows cooperating banks to write into their ledgers. Every time a loan is taken out, the bank, which needs to hold a deposit, only a fraction of the sum requested, simply magics that money into existence. It's basically an officially backed Ponzi scheme. In an independent Scotland, the question will soon arise which government is doing the backing of this fiat money and of the credit. Edinburgh or London? One, both, or neither? Furthermore, this debt-based system is in a permanent state of unstable equilibrium. If, for whatever reason, too many customers demand the return of their deposits in cash, even as mere pieces of paper, a run on the bank would result, and the magic of money would collapse. Westminster would not support troubled Scottish banks, certainly if it meant damaging the credibility of sterling. And what is more troubling, Westminster interference with and limiting of the operation of Scottish banks could even precipitate such a run. The state's money supply depends on the total debt incurred when purchasing or renting within its jurisdiction. The more assets that can be turned into property and bought, the greater the debt, the greater the supply of money. The complication of Scotland being outside sterling's jurisdiction has to be addressed, because Westminster would by necessity place strict controls on the lending of Scottish banks to allow them whenever they are given permission to use sterling. No quantitative easing would be allowed. But as an intellectual exercise, let's suppose the Scottish government stays in control of its money supply. Then a Scottish pound would not be a pound sterling. Just because the Scottish currency is denominated as sterling and their notes promise to pay the bearer on demand in sterling, that doesn't mean they are sterling banknotes, no more than an Australian dollar is a US dollar. After independence, these would be foreign banknotes, not just in England but around the world, at the mercy of the foreign exchanges. Consequently, bank accounts and credit cards would have to distinguish between Scottish and sterling pounds, in line with the notes. Most of the money supply is actually created by the population itself, over and above the government float. That float being a mortgage on state-owned property and future taxation. Given the uncertainty surrounding the Scottish economy and its relatively small size after independence, the currency would be quickly discounted. On independence, every bank account and line of credit in Scotland would no longer be denominated in sterling, but in Scottish pounds. Prior to independence, every shrewd Scot would be frantically opening bank accounts in England and moving their money south of the border, causing a run on the Scottish banking system, which Westminster, believe me, it would just ignore. Even the Royal Bank of Scotland, based in Edinburgh since 1727, says it will move its headquarters to London on Scottish independence. Alison Rose, chief executive of the parent company, NatWest Group, which was bailed out by the UK government in 2008. Believe me, Westminster won't be bailing out any Scottish banks. Alison Rose says the bank's balance sheet is too big for a Scottish economy, although the bank's dedication to Scotland would remain unchanged. Whatever that means. No bank can allow its reserves and investments to be demarcated in a rapidly discounted currency. But RBS is one of the banks that print Scottish banknotes. Would a Scottish government allow them to continue printing banknotes from London? What if the Bank of Scotland and the Clydesdale Bank also flee south? Then what bank would be left to supply banknotes and loans? And the tricky question arises for all the other banks. Would the pounds in, say, an Edinburgh branch of Barclays be denominated in Scottish pounds or sterling? It gets complicated. Now, banks across southern Europe are watching the outcome of this scenario with increasing alarm. This could be their future, because far from the Eurozone being a financial utopia, the EU's sloppy response to COVID-19 pandemic means that huge cracks previously hidden are now beginning to show. I, for one, believe that the collapse of the euro looks ever more likely. I predict by 2029. Yeah. You have to see an earlier video where I give you my reasons. Southern European banks would be left holding rapidly discounted Spanish, Italian, Portuguese and Greek euros, whereas the new Deutschmark, the German euro, would rise sharply in value. Money will be pouring out of Southern European banks into German ones. Back in Scotland, coinage too would become a problem. The Royal Mint would have to stop supplying sterling coinage, as the face value of a sterling coin in Scotland would be less than its sterling value south of the border. Also, the Royal Mint need no longer supply, they're not obliged to supply sterling coinage. So a Scottish mint would have to produce any surplus they require, or they would soon run out of the small coins needed for micro purchases. This is what happened in late 18th century England when the Royal Mint failed to keep up with the demand for copper coinage. Private enterprise had to step in and create the required scale of coinage. It took 2 decades for the official coinage to reassert itself. The Scottish government would have to issue private coins. In the short term, the Scottish Mint would probably be outsourced to the Royal Mint or possibly to some other foreign mint. Since their output would not be official English coins of the realm, the new coins would have to be distinguished from sterling coinage. That's yet another layer of complexity. You can ask, would this discounting actually matter? Because Scottish goods should then become cheaper in the global markets. Yes, of course it's going to matter. In all likelihood, there'll be rampant inflation north of the border following the discounting of Scottish currency. And this would cancel out any benefit. And this would also discount the currency even more. Of course, I could be wrong in what is, after all, my very simplistic analysis. I'm very happy for viewers or the future to put me right. Nevertheless, the point I am trying to make is that independence for Scotland, with the strategy of keep sterling in the interim, will herald in a tsunami of complexity, not limited to just the loss of support from the Barnett formula and the few consequences I have highlighted. There'll be a lot more problems. No wonder First Minister Nicola Sturgeon can't be pinned down on her plans to manage the economy of an independent Scotland. It's far too complex for there to be a simple answer. That is, until after all the consequences have settled down. The rapid build-up and fallout from complexity is truly amazing. I can only wish Miss Sturgeon and all the other utopians in the world good luck in their ventures, because they're going to need it.